Hello, everybody, and welcome to Karma Insights. I am so excited to introduce to you today. Jeffery Roth is the author of Fires, Floods, and Taxicabs. And before that, he was the Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Department of Veteran Affairs, the Taxi and Limousine Commission. He was the Assistant Commissioner for the New York Fire Department. He has been a leader in the National Guard for over 10 years. And really, at the end of the day, Jeff is the quintessential public servant, someone who leads through his actions, rolling up his sleeves, and getting things done. I am so excited to share this conversation. There is so much to learn from Jeff.
Jeff, I'm so excited to have you here. Jeff and I have known each other since 2007 or so, when I was a management consultant working on some work with the New York City Housing Authority, and I think you were in the mayor's office trying to get support in having standards for customer service across the city. And Jeff, I think you were kind enough to have lunch with me and to get to know this young guy new to city government and new to working in the management consulting space. And I really appreciated it back then. And I don't know if I ever told you this, but when my colleagues found out that I was having lunch with someone, they were like, "Gosh, you're such a goodie." They were making fun of me. They were like, "What is this?" But I really appreciated getting to know you back then and keeping in touch, and then reconnecting most recently. It's been a lot of fun for me. Thanks for that lunch 15 years ago, and it's great to now talk with you about your book and all your experiences 15 years later. So Jeff, one of the things that dawned on me while I was reading your book was how you, and I don't know if you feel this way, but how you have been intertwined with really historic aspects of New York City for the past 15 years or so. I'm just curious, does it arise for you like that? After writing the book, did you take a step back and you're like, oh, wow, this is what I've been part of? What has that process been for you in recollecting all of these really important pieces of work that you engaged in?
First, thank you for having lunch with me. I think that it was my pleasure for sure. And hard to believe that was 14, 15 years ago already. We were both younger men there, or curly haired youth. But certainly time has flown by. Yeah, when I was writing the book, look, I grew up in a small town in the Midwest outside Detroit in Michigan. And so a dream of mine as a student of public policy and urban planning was to work on urban problems someplace. And I happened to land in New York City, which has among the biggest in terms of the government and the size of problems and the size of solutions and the complexity and all of that. Yeah, it's been a real adventure. And when I wrote the book, it did help me look back and go, wow, there have been some really interesting policy questions that I've been part of, project teams that I've been part of, things that I've gotten to do as a result of my time in city government here in New York City. And so it's been a real privilege and an honor to be part of those things. When you're in it day to day, mired in the work of doing these sorts of things, I don't think you always have, at least I didn't have this broader picture of, oh, this is what I'm part of, until you've removed yourself a little bit, either to write a book or to reflect on things that you've done, where it does come together in a way. So, whoa, those were some pretty interesting things for a young guy coming from the Midwest, just landing in New York City, to get involved in some of these issues. Has been a real treat. And like I said, adventure, I think, is the right word, with the ups and downs and all of that. But looking back, it was a remarkable journey, one I'm very grateful for. I learned a lot, and I hope I was able to contribute in some ways to this city that's home for me, to the institutions I worked with and was a part of. And I think so. I think I was able to contribute some value to those things, and I learned a great deal as well.
Yeah, I would say for sure. And one of the things that I think it was later on at the end of the book you were talking about was your desire to really get into the harsh realities of what it is to be human, the human experiences. And I think you talked about Romania and the orphanage, and then also talking with two twins whose father was in prison. When I was reading that part, and I'm sure there was so many other aspects that you could have shared as well, but it sounds like there was like a very deep set of values that have been coming, that there's been an undercurrent of your values that has been coming through in your work, and a desire to understand what is going on in the ground, the worm's eye view of things. I would be curious to hear about that. What was it that drove you in this direction to get involved in this way? What are some of those things, those dots that connected, that I need to stay focused on the human aspect of this, as opposed to being caught up with, let's be honest, some really fancy things that you've been working on? These are not just trivial problems. These are big problems, but I noticed this current of groundedness in it all. And that doesn't just happen in my view. There is some value that is coming forth in that work. So open-ended question there, but what comes up for you in that?
Sure. I think that the start of it all for me was I grew up in like I said, a small town in Michigan, but what was unique about that was very much the place I grew up in, we all looked very similar. We were not the suburbs. We were a small town outside the Detroit suburban ring. You have Detroit, the urban core, particularly at the time in the 1980s and 90s, was majority people of color, Black. And then you had the suburbs, which were historically white. And then you had this more rural ring, which is where I grew up, small towns dotting the landscape, where in the place I grew up, we all looked the same. But one of the things that we faced as a town just outside the suburban ring in my childhood was urban sprawl. So you saw this unbridled development and growth occurring along the expressways where it didn't seem well planned or thought out. And it was changing the character and nature of the town that I grew up in. And that's where the light bulb started to go on for me in terms of, hey, the built environment impacts how we live our lives. Over time, I had experiences and opportunities to go to inner city Detroit to work with a program it was actually my church was doing a program with a church in inner city Detroit, where we did a partnership program. And we went into Detroit one night each week and did tutoring with some youth there. I was in high school at the time, and we'd go every Tuesday, and we built relationships with the kids that we worked with over time, and with this organization that we were partnered with. And that's where I started to connect some dots about, again, the built environment and how it impacts people's lives. And here you were talking about a decaying urban core in Detroit that was full of concentrated poverty and other issues. And you had spatial mismatch between job opportunities and the people who needed jobs and all of these things. And that's where I started to say, hey, the built environment in terms of how we plan and design our communities really does impact people's lives, not just in rural communities where you see this urban sprawl, but also in the urban centers where you see these kids growing up in places that are facing significant and serious issues. And that was really the beginning for me of forming this awareness or interest in how do these things tie together? How does policy tie in with urban design, urban planning, and those sorts of things? And then through all that, as you mentioned, I had opportunity to go and work in Romania in orphanages. I think I spent 4 summers there while I was in high school and college, working with a nonprofit there. And just that's where I think for me, I connected at a big scale how public policy could affect people's everyday lives. The orphanage system in Romania, as a result of their Soviet dictator in the 1980s, Nicolae Ceausescu, had pretty ruinous policies that he was trying to create the world's largest workforce. So he had outlawed birth control and other things, and outlawed contraception, and wanted families to create as many children as possible so he could have this magnificent workforce. But as a result, families couldn't always afford to care for all the kids that they had. And so they had to create a state-led program, the orphanage system, where kids could go and live during maybe a portion of the year. And while we say orphanage, for most of these kids, they weren't orphans. They had maybe a one parent or 2 parents or siblings that lived somewhere in town nearby, and they'd be aware of that. And so there were these deep-seated emotional issues about feeling abandoned and why am I here at the orphanage, whereas I have siblings that live at home. Some of the kids would be in the orphanage system during their school year and then go home to work on the farms in the summer. So there were just a lot of these things. But that for me connected working on the, as you said, the worm's eye view of these sorts of issues, dealing with the kids with some of these emotional traumas, and connecting that to macro policy that was set at the dictator level in this country. started again to connect some dots for me. And so these early experiences just helped me understand that there's people involved here. You set policies. How you build your world affects and implements those policies, and it affects very real people. And so those were my early experiences. That's what I took with me when I went to graduate school and said, okay, let me formally study these things. And that's where I studied public policy and urban planning, which ultimately led me to a position in Mayor Bloomberg's office in New York City right after grad school. I think I graduated on a Thursday, moved to New York City on a Friday, and started work on a Monday. And that was my inauguration to New York City, having not spent maybe a day or two here, I think, while I was in grad school. That was the first time I'd stepped foot in New York City. And was immediately immersed in New York City policy, New York City politics, learning how the city operates, both in terms of its government and its people, the built environment, how you plan it. But there was one thing that the Bloomberg administration had done that really turned me on. And I didn't work directly on it, but it was the Plan YC, which was a sustainability plan for New York City that the Bloomberg administration put together that said, essentially, hey, from up until 2030, we expect the city to grow by 1 million new people. How do you plan for that? How do you ensure that the city is sustainable, has clean water, clean air, has green spaces, has transportation that works for all people, is equitable, has jobs, and all of those things? So it was, for someone that was thinking regionally and about urban planning, those sorts of things, this was the place to be and the administration to be in and step in and get to work on some of these things. Yeah, it was a circuitous route to get here, but for me, working in New York City government allowed me to do just that, was to connect this policy, urban interest, planning, built environment with, hey, when we do things, they affect real people. So let's be mindful of that.
I recall when Plan NYC came out and all the focus on broadband, and that really dictated a lot of the trajectory of my career, frankly, and the areas that I focused on in the management consulting world, and then also in the nonprofit education space. It's interesting to hear. It did really, it put on paper the magnitude of the challenges ahead. And I think that was a humbling thing that frankly inspired a lot of us to want to get involved with. That's our city, that's our home. How can we support it in being the best version of itself? I'm curious, Jeff, there's a lot of different directions I want to go, but one of the things that I find, and just to touch back on some of the stuff from the prior, what you were just talking about in terms of your work in Romania and when work in inner city Detroit, when you were up for commissioner and someone said to you, you were too nice or something like that. I found that really interesting. How does that sit for you? Because clearly you have your way of being, your character, how you treat others, your respect. And I see that from the work that you do and all of that. Clearly there is a tie between some of your values that you've brought from home to your work. How do those kinds of things sit with you? Because it's like you've come into this, they call it, New York City could be, I don't know what it would be if it was ranked in terms of GDP from a country perspective, but I'm sure it's bigger than 80% of the countries out there. Like New York City is not just a city, it's its own country. Let's be honest here. You're getting into a really tough environment. And frankly, you're a nice, good man that treats everyone with respect, and you're trying to espouse these values while staying idealistic, but also staying grounded. Did you ever feel pushback on that personally as you tried to traverse that path?
In that situation, yes. I think for me, there was some, I don't want to say naivete. Certainly, there was some element of that. That was my first foray into more the political realm. Certainly, when you work in the policy sector of New York City government, you do have to go before the city council, you do go before the public, but my role had always been more analyst level, right? So I was behind the scenes, I was preparing commissioners, I was doing data analysis and reports, I was thinking through what are the right policy interventions in these problematic areas and those sorts of things. So I'd always been behind the scenes, which you're somewhat shielded from the noise of the external. So stepping into this as the lead contender, I wasn't just there on behalf of my agency or my commissioner doing a presentation to the city council. I was there to present myself. And so there was a learning curve for me. And I was very much relying on the guidance and direction of others to usher me through that. And I think I did so at the cost of my own intuition and instinct. I certainly, and I think I talk about this in the book, there were certain things that I felt like should I should have been doing, but I didn't listen to that voice enough to say we're not moving forward or I'm not moving forward until I've had opportunity to do it my way. So I stepped in acknowledging the expertise of others and followed that. So looking back, that's one of the lessons I've learned is, hey, I had this nagging voice inside that said, whoa, like there should be more engagement with the city council before you go in front of this hearing. I feel like I should have met with more. We met with two of the city council members, one being the speaker, one being the chair of the transportation committee that deals most closely with the Taxi and Limousine Commission. And those were the only two one-on-one meetings that I had leading into what was talked about behind closed doors as a pro forma, for lack of a better term. This was just a hearing that was procedural. Hey, you're going to go there. Yeah, they're going to grill you. Yeah, they're going to ask some questions, probably even some tough questions. They'll try to embarrass you. But at the end of the day, they just have to go through that. It's just a step in the process. You'll get confirmed. There'll be some posturing and showmanship. But at the end of the day, you'll be made chair and commissioner of the Taxi and Limousine Commission. And here's things that you're allowed to talk about and say, and here's things that you're not allowed to talk about and say, because the mayor or others have already made policy statements about those sorts of things. So there was a lot of things that I knew going into it that I could talk about and certain things I couldn't talk about. But looking back again, I think the lesson for me was I should have listened to myself a little more to say, hey, my style is to build one-on-one relationships and engage with folks. And I should have done more of that leading up to the actual hearing. So there'd been some rapport with some folks. So they would have known who I am and my story a little bit more than what you can share in a 5-minute opening statement and in some questions that were pretty issue focused. Yeah, definite lesson and a hard lesson to learn when it's very public that way. And in some ways, the headlines following it were humiliating. But look, it's if you can't take those sorts of things or you don't want to deal with those sorts of things, certainly New York City and certainly New York City politics is not the place to dip your toes into that type of world. It's to be expected to some degree.
Yeah, you know, that I think so. You write about it as the importance of being authentic, or that was the advice that someone had given to you. And it's interesting because as I was reading through your book, and especially clearly the first half of it, but this idea of authenticity and being yourself. And because in that instance, you're going up in front of city council and clearly there's a lot of politics, a bunch of stuff that you're not even, that you're in this position, you clearly are extremely qualified for the role and it has nothing to do with it. And still attempting to be authentic. And frankly, though, one of the things that came up for me as I was reading through your book was that same experience everyone has in their own microcosm of whether it's an interview, whether it's in a work environment, on how to be themselves and ask or say to express themselves as they would and to be true to themselves. And that does seem like a very tough way to get that grueling lesson. And I'm sure you'll never forget that one. And frankly, as I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, that is a really tough experience. But to take that pause and to, Jeff, when they asked you there, would you issue an apology? I could imagine all the stuff going through your head because I remember reading those articles in the New York Times about the suicides occurring, and this was not an easy time.
Yeah.
And how do you show your humanity while also keeping within the box of the politics of this so you can navigate that? I was like, oh geez, that's a complex issue that I've never had to face.
Yeah, and the other piece of it, which I couldn't say in the hearing, was how late the city council was to these issues. We had been pushing. I arrived at the Taxi and Limousine Commission in late 2014, and the summer of 2015 was when the de Blasio administration, with the support of the Taxi and Limousine Commission, where I was at the time, was pushing to do many of the measures that the city council just more recently enacted several years before they got on board with it. So that was the other side of the equation, which you can't say when you're appearing before the city council. It's like, where were you all? We've been pushing on these issues for a long time. Welcome to the program. But certainly that wouldn't play well in a space where you're trying to get confirmed by that same body. But yeah, these are difficult issues. They're complex. We'd all been working on them. I think what the city council and the posturing they did, at least certain members of the city council that were questioned that day, was very much to show they were in command of those issues, though for years or a very long time that those issues had fallen on deaf ears by the push from the administration to pass some of those things. And the city council didn't show up until it became much more critical and crucial. And then suddenly they were more prepared to deal with these things. Yeah, it goes both ways. It certainly wasn't the forum where you could push back on those things. But yeah, it was a real lesson. And when you go back and think about it, certainly, hey, there's ways I could have answered questions differently, or I could have been more prepared to answer that question, or I knew that, or I drew a blank. All those things happen when you're in a hot seat and in an environment where it's not your own. And there's certain players that were very much intent on attacking me, like you say, not for personal reasons. I don't think it was about me, but to make a statement about the administration and the administration's nominees. Again, I think that's just part of the game. If you want to dabble in that in New York City, that comes with the territory. But what a way to learn some of those lessons.
Yeah. Picking up on what you were just talking about, your work in the Taxi and Limousine Commission, of highlighting some of those issues early on, and I think that I can at least say this, I can at least speak to this, whether it's been when I've been in management consulting or when I've been in a corporation or even in the nonprofit world, it is this, you might identify some issue that is really important, where you're like, oh, wow, we have our thumb on something that is critical. And yet turning the steering of the giant ship that is an organization is hard. And frankly, we can all see this in this past pandemic year of how agile we are all being forced to be as individuals, but organizations, as governments, and all of these things. But what are some of the things that you're taking away at that higher level of how do you actually help? Like, you're looking back and you were looking at these problems in 2014, and now you're and the commission, you're being grilled on this in the seat to talk about these same things, and you're like, wow, nothing has really happened. And maybe I'm adding more words than I should there, but not enough has happened. And so now looking back, do you have any, maybe this is for posterity's sake, here's how you can inch things forward more. What things do you think about? You're like, hey, these are the things that I would think about in the future to help push these things along at a broader scale. And I asked that from that perspective in particular, because one of the things that came up for me, Jeff, as I was reading your book, was that there was such an amazing and impressive focus on getting things done. Like that, there was this theme of get it done, and you got it. There was the work of just day in and day out doing the small steps to move something along. And now I'm thinking to myself, for these big ones where no one wants to focus on getting it done, what would you do now to bring attention to something to get it done? Because I think that's what all of us are facing these days, is the issues we all face are so incredibly complex. And it's beyond any of us, and yet we all care, whether it's climate change or whether it's what do you do about Uber and Lyft and everything going on in the city. These are complex, new problems that no one has faced before, that no one knows the right answer to. How do you look at these things today? I guess I'll say this, everyone has their color commentary on news, television these days, and you probably are like, yeah, that's not how it works. What wisdom can you share from your experience?
I think and I talked about it in the book, I think one of the biggest struggles, and then I'll relate it to the TLC here in a minute, is what I call painting the picture. And this is something management consultants, I think, are very good at doing. It's what they're trained to do. I think as a young policy analyst, when I came into the Bloomberg administration, it was very much what we were pushed to do, was to gather as much evidence and data about a specific problem as possible. I talked early in the book about the Deutsche Bank building fire, which was a building that was destroyed in the World Trade Center attacks. Well, it was damaged enough that it needed to be taken down in the World Trade Center attacks. And as it was being demolished, there were certain issues inside the building that led to a fire. Fire occurs, and 2 firefighters get trapped in the building and sadly die as a result of smoke inhalation. The Bloomberg administration at the time said, hey, we need to understand what was going on in the building. Why didn't the city know about it? And if the city knew about it, or some entity within city government knew about it, why didn't the fire department know about it? So 2 firefighters wouldn't get trapped in the building while fighting the fire. And the only way to really unpack that was to go and draw a picture. And that's exactly what we did. Quite literally, I was put in charge of creating the process diagrams to understand information and data flows between city agencies, to see if we could pinpoint, hey, where did the system break down? Where did the process break down? Why wasn't there information sharing between these city agencies? And when we did that, it uncovered a whole number of issues and problems that for whatever reason, whether it was informal relationships between city agencies, there was just no need or mechanism in place for sharing or exchange of data because no one thought that that would be a problem until there was a problem. But it was uncovering it and really trying to paint a picture of, hey, here's what's going on. Here's where we need to look and pay attention and draw some focus and energy in terms of policy intervention. I think that's one of the most key and important things that people in the policy realm, not the political realm, in the policy realm, the politicians give the big vision and the big ideas. I think those in the background, the policy work say, okay, here's how we create and craft policy that moves us towards that thing. And I think to craft good policy, particularly on the operational side, we're talking operational policy, is understanding how does that operate today? What is happening? What's working well? What's not working? And how do we draw attention to that? One of the ways we did that at the Taxi and Limousine Commission, and when I joined the team, the Taxi and Limousine Commission had just passed rules to mandate trip record collection from these new companies. All companies had to require trip records. This was on the yellow taxi side. They were already doing this in systems within the vehicles that would track trips by passengers, but this wasn't occurring in the for-hire vehicle sector in an automated data exchange sort of way, particularly by companies like Uber, Lyft, et cetera. So they had to maintain records. Those records could be viewed, but what we did was pass rules to data collection that was more automated and digital. So they had to start providing those trip records to the city. I think at the time it was every month for the previous month's time frame by a certain date, and we had to build that out. But by building out that rule, which said, hey, you're going to supply the city with trip records, the city could then paint a picture of, hey, here's what's actually going on in this sector. We knew how many drivers they had. We knew how many vehicles they had that were affiliated with those bases, but we didn't necessarily know what trips were occurring and where those pickups were taking place. But once we had those data, we could start to paint a picture and understand, hey, where are they doing their business? Because the companies might say one thing, oh, we're equitable, we're available all over. But when we started to look at the trip records, it's like, I don't know, you're in the business core doing a lot of your pickups. But by having the data, we could start to really understand what the situation was and paint that picture. And I think that's one of the most valuable things you can do to move in the new policy direction is just have the hard evidence. And that may be, it could be data or data, some element of it. It may be drawing a picture of a process and how it works. It may be going out and interviewing. I talk a lot in my book about go out and do ride-alongs. Go talk to the people who are doing the work that you're interested in and ask them for their perspective and their advice. And you'll get pretty quickly where those problem areas are. And they'll often tell you what the solution ought to be. And so it's no mystery at all when you engage with the stakeholders, the people doing the work. And that's both internally, if you're talking about an operation, the people that do the work internally, or go talk to the experts externally. Hey, who is involved in this arena that has been fighting this fight every day? Whether it's you're talking about homelessness, go talk to the people who are working on it, who might be external to city government, and also talk to the people internally in city government who are doing this work and try to understand and paint a picture of what are the barriers to get us to moving to a better place. Those are the sorts of things I think good analysts do in the background to understand and digest a problem, develop courses of action and policy intervention measures, and to move things forward. And that takes a lot of time to do. It's very hard work to be comprehensive about it. It takes a lot of resources in terms of time and energy, but when you can really define a problem, the solutions come out of that. And then you can see where, hey, if we focus resources on these key areas, we can change the direction of the ship, even a few degrees, even just a tiny bit, but over time, that'll have long-term positive effects.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, if you really can define a problem, the solutions will come through that. And I think that I'm really hearing that in the wisdom in that, because the problem is one thing, but as you peel the onion layers on something, you start to see a bit more, and that makes a lot of sense. I think one of the things you also talked about in the book, which I found particularly interesting, was that you would share with more senior folks about these ride-alongs that you were doing, and that actually gave you credibility in those conversations such that others would listen to you. And I think that kind of helps paint the picture for me of, and in some ways, saying this out loud, it almost feels obvious, but then in reflection, it's, oh, wow, there's a lot there of how do you get someone to trust that you are trying to truly understand what is going on so that all your work is useful to them, is meaningful, can have some impact, so that they know that you're trying to take on the situation of their team, their staff, to help progress their vision forward. And I really liked a lot of how you, some of the tips you were sharing around how to cut through bureaucracy. I laughed a couple of times where your boss wrote you an email asking for status, and then you forward that email along to someone else that you needed to get to do something. I was like, that's brilliant.
And how many times I've used that with my team? It's what do we call it? I named it after my boss when he introduced that method to me. You don't always have to be the bad guy. Let me be the bad guy. I'll send you a nasty gram by email that you can use to forward to get other people to move. Yeah, and I've employed that with my team a number of times. I'm like, hey, if you need me to send you a strongly worded email that you can forward to get something dislodged, then let's do it. Because sometimes it's just people need a little reminder, a little jolt. And so, yeah, it's a simple tool, but it's been probably one of the more effective things that I've ever used.
Yeah, I'd love to talk through some of that because a lot of them really resonated. I almost felt at times when I was reading the book, Jeff, that I was like, it's almost as though, and it's funny for me because I've been on the management consulting side of this, and I was like, yeah, this is basically the whole playbook for being a management consultant, whether you're in the public or private sector, on how to get something actually done. And so I'd love to jump into that because I think that there's a lot of valuable lessons on just how to get things done. If you were to, there's so many, I'm going to ask it to you at a high level, but I might also try to pipe in and ask for your feedback on a couple of them. If you were to talk to someone entering the workforce today or someone tackling some really big, hairy problems, what are some of the things that you'd say, here are the big ones that I would focus on for helping push the dime forward?
Mm-hmm. I think a lost art, and maybe this is something I've honed on the military side because it's still talked about there, and there's lots of ways to describe it, but managing up, understanding your boss's needs. I think if you can start in a position and really understand what keeps your boss awake at night, what's on their plate that's nagging them that they wish they could take off their plate, if you can make yourself valuable to helping provide some solve to those wounds or to those nagging areas, you get buy-in from your boss, you get more autonomy, you get more flexibility and freedom because you've shown your value. I think I always try to do that early on in my career, and maybe it's just natural. I tried to please my boss, right? But over time, I learned, hey, you ask the right questions of your boss. Try to understand what is on their mind. Where can you help maybe provide a solution? Where can you help them organize their thoughts? Where can you do a routine task or take something off their plate so they don't have to worry about it? And in so doing, you show your immediate value, but you also get opportunity to climb into their head and learn from them in terms of, what are they thinking about in terms of the organization? What are they thinking about strategically? Where do they see long-term this team or this unit going? So you also avail yourself to their knowledge. And so doing, you create maybe a mentorship program without even really knowing that's what you're doing, or they don't know that's what they're doing. But you just build that relationship by proving value and trying to take on some of the work of your boss and take that off their plate. So their jobs are easier, their lives are easier, and you develop some credibility and some value with the team. I think that's a great place to start. And also, any project I do, I think it's critical, and I think I touch on this in the book, but to push information, there's pushing and pulling information, right? Never be a person in any organization where a boss or a client, whoever that client is, could be your boss, it could be a commissioner, it could be a CEO or whomever you report eventually up to. Don't ever make them ask you for information, whether it's the status of a project, where something is, if something's slowed up in a process someplace, if you need their help, if there's some risk that you're taking on in terms of a project, if something's going to be delayed. Never make them come to you to ask what that is. Always push the information. I have found that to be of extreme value in creating autonomy. Because if you go into a situation and say, okay, I'm going to manage this project, or I have this report I've got to write, or a team I've got to manage, and we've got some initiative we've got to get done by a certain timeline. If you put a project plan together and start giving a monthly or a weekly, a daily status report, maybe monthly, whatever the recurring basis that makes sense for the project and your organization, if you just start pushing that unasked to your boss or to your stakeholders, to your client, your committee, your task force, whoever you report to, you start pushing the information to them, the chances of them coming to ask you for something dwindles precipitously. because they know, oh, hey, every Friday I'm going to get this report from so-and-so. There's no need to go ask for it. I know I'm going to get it by Friday, close of business, or whatever the recurring time frame is. But I think that's another way to show value and organize your day and to create autonomy, is if you're pushing the information and letting people know the status of things, where things are, they're never left wondering. They always know, oh, hey, I know so-and-so's got this. I know the status of things. And even where there's a risk or a problem, they're on top of it. They're aware of it and they're managing it. And always ask for help. So one thing that I've learned to do, and maybe I didn't do this early in my career, but I certainly know to do it now, is you've got to go to decision makers and say, hey, I'm trying to move this initiative forward. I'm trying to move this project forward. Here's where I need help. Here's what I need you to do. And that helps manage up as well by putting on the plate the things that are appropriate, where, hey, this is beyond my pay grade. I need you to go move this mountain. I can't get this person to respond to me. Sir, ma'am, can you help me here? And you put this on the plate of your superior or your boss. You give them something actionable they can do to contribute to the project, and you help shape and hone. I think those are some of the key skills I've learned. Just those are project management, but it's about getting things done. But it's also about building relationships, showing your value, and being transparent with where things stand in a way where you're pushing that information, so no one ever has to come knock on your door and ask. Some of the key things that I've learned in my career.
I appreciate that, Jeff. One of the pieces that something new that I learned from your book was this idea of battle rhythms. And I was like, wow, just the phrase gives it power in and of itself, right? Could you share a little bit about that? Because I think there was something, and I know you also talk about routine as well in the book, and just it's the power of this battle rhythm or routine and how that contributes to it sounded like also to your sanity in tough situations, but also to getting things done, also to building trust. I'd love to hear about that from you.
Yeah, so battle rhythm, just a fancy term, and maybe there's a more peaceful or way to name it. But it's a tool by the military for staff to manage a staff and the time of a staff for a commander. And for example, in 2020, I was deployed overseas with my division staff. A division staff is hundreds of personnel with all of these functions that are trying to integrate and synchronize and coordinate all of their activities. And the only way to get everyone on the same page and rowing in the same direction is through a battle rhythm, which is essentially just the routine of the staff, a schedule of, hey, here's what meetings are due and when, here's what working groups have to meet to prepare for key meetings or prepare for key decision points. Hey, there's this report that's due at this time to our higher headquarters, so we need all the subordinate pieces of that by this date and time each week. So it's just that you call it a battle rhythm because it's this daily cycle that you go through of, hey, every day I do these things, every week I do these other things, and they all feed into some purpose, whether it's a decision making, whether it's information sharing, whether it's preparing a commander or a boss of some type with, hey, here's what you need to know as you go into your meeting, whatever it is. It's just that natural rhythm that gets designed and you eventually build in an organization so that you're ensuring that all the things that need to get done are getting done in the appropriate time. Because you have a meeting, that meeting creates something, right? Or a good meeting does, right? You have some output from that meeting that's then an input for something else. And so if you're managing a large staff or an organization, if you create a battle rhythm where meetings have a purpose and the outputs of those flow in as an input for something else, you can create a system and a cycle for these things that are natural. An example might be, if we go back to the reporting, if I'm pushing information to my boss, if I know, hey, on Fridays, my boss, the commissioner, has to send a report to his or her deputy mayor over at City Hall. They're going to need the key inputs to that report from their subordinates, probably earlier that morning or the night before or whatever time frame. And so you'd say, okay, City Hall reports due Friday by 5 p.m., but we need internal reports due to the commissioner at 5 p.m. Thursday. And so then you start to have a battle rhythm. Okay, then those people backward plan and say, if I have to have my inputs to the commissioner at 5 p.m. on Thursday, I need from my teams Thursday morning, their inputs by 10 a.m. So you start to build this out in a way where things nest and flow into that final product. And that's called a battle rhythm. But when you build that out for every meeting, every key input, all these data reports, it becomes quite an expansive document. But when you get good at managing those things, it always keeps people focused in terms of a staff on the most important things. And if you do this in the right way, you can be proactive instead of being reactive. hey, if we know these things are coming up, at least for everything, there's always going to be reaction in any organization. But the more robust and well thought out your battle rhythm is, I think the more you can prevent having to react to things, because you're already planning for it, or you're already aware of the sorts of issues that might come up, or you've got teams that are prepared to respond to those things that might meet regularly, those sorts of things. So I think having a strong battle rhythm, which is that routine, which is that schedule for an organization, is critical to the healthy functioning of a staff or an organization.
I appreciate that. Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to jump to, Jeff, and I know we're all almost already up with time here, but I'll try to be quick. You talked about the synchronization matrix, but then one of the things that you talked about that also came up for me in a very strong way was the situations where you're overseeing what is legitimately an emergency, where people's lives are on the line, where you have to just serve, and it's the immediate priorities and steps that are in front of you. And two things that came up for me on that. One is the context of that situation is so fundamentally different than what most of us are used to on a day-to-day basis of our work. Whether you're in any private sector, we're used to being able to breaking down a problem into its pieces and saying, I'm going to focus on this piece, that piece, and that piece. And then when you're in an emergency situation, that context is different. And I saw you talking about that, and it almost felt subtle for me, but it just seemed like a huge thing that you were touching on there. And frankly, I'm thinking about this past pandemic year where everyone went into an emergency scenario and had to do this. And frankly, this needs to be more of a skill on what to do and how to understand what to do in tough situations. If you could share for a couple of minutes about that, I think it would be a great service.
Yeah, and luckily the military trains, we don't call them emergency management so much, we just call it operations. In a military organization, you just deal with things that come up, right? And that could be an emergency, such as someone's hurt, someone's lost, there's a vehicle accident, those sorts of things that we might consider emergencies are just everyday operations for a military organization. But on the civilian side, you have training with the incident command system and things like that through FEMA. So there are ways to train and learn the structure and the apparatus that should go in place when there is emergency response required. But as an individual, when I've been in situations where I've had to coordinate response of some kind, I think, as you mentioned, to COVID, when I was overseas last year, I wasn't there to work on COVID. COVID was this thing we heard about before we got overseas. And when we got overseas, quickly learned how much this was going to be a focus of our deployment. And I was put in charge of leading our COVID response operations as the chief of operations. We had an operations cell that ran 24/7, that was monitoring all the statistics and information that you could think of that would be important to understanding, hey, where are our service members located? What care would they need if someone does test positive for COVID? We operate across multiple countries. What are their rules and regulations? What facilities do they have to treat service members who might have COVID or symptoms? So we had to paint a picture of all that stuff. And I can remember there were many times when situations came up that we had never encountered before that were wild. And you're just like, okay, we've got to manage this thing. We're being asked to do this thing. It's got to be dealt with right now. It's immediate. What do we do? And for us, we would rely on our training, those sorts of things. But we, in my operations center, we had a large whiteboard. I'd pull the team in and say, we always say, what do we know? And we'd write it up on the board. Hey, this is what we know. What do we need to know right away? We'd put those up. And if we didn't have the information on those things, we'd say, where do we go to get it? And some of those things, it was pretty clear, oh, you got to call this person or call that entity. In other cases, you might not know. You're like, okay, if we don't know, how do we get ICU bed availability rates in Kuwait, for example? Okay, I don't have that information handy, but I can call our medical affairs officer. I can call the liaison officers that work with the host nations and see if they know who we can contact. So you just start to think through, okay, what information do I have? What information do I need? And for the information I need, what's most immediate? And where can I go to start to put the wheels in motion, the gears in motion to collect that information? And when you do that, at least for me, in the way my mind works, is when I can do that and I can put up on a board, here's what I know, here's what I need to know, here's what's priority in terms of gathering that information. Again, it goes back to painting that picture. You then can start to breathe a little bit and say, okay, I'm getting a sense for what we need to do based on what I know and what I think we know and where we need to go to get information. And in that action, just by taking some action and starting to gather up the information, it gives your brain time to start to frame, okay, what do we need to do about this thing, given what we know? And that starts to come through as you gather the data and start to put some parameters around it. At least for me, that's been the way to do it. You got to gather those data and understand what it is and size it up, understand where the issues are, where you can't get data. That's important to know. And all of that starts to feed into, okay, what's our immediate next step? What do we need to do now? Who needs to know? How do we inform them? What don't we know? How do we get that data? And what actions need to be taken right now?
Wow. Thank you, Jeff. I imagine this small office in the middle in Kuwait somewhere where you're like, it's like you're hearing the rumblings of a pandemic at the doorstep and you're like, we have to figure this out. And so I appreciate that. Jeff, there's so many other areas that we could go into here, but I so thank you for your time and talking about this stuff. I thank you for writing the book. I think it's just really, it's fun to read. Not only is it practical, but when you start sharing some of the stories of your personal experience or your stories of implementing these things, and later on in the book, some of the fun things of you starting a new agency and all of that in the startup world of government. I just thought it was fun. What fun, crazy situations to be in where basically your hands are tied behind your back and you're trying to put something together. It's remarkable. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for the time today. Thank you for reading the book and allowing me to share. I appreciate you, and I'm very grateful for the time today. This is great.
Yeah.